Late autumn. The dim light of the morning stretched through the bare branches, casting a pale yellow hue on the courtyard of Westminster Palace. The golden leaves fell slowly, scattered on the ground like fragments of memories, where peace and stillness could hide untold stories. But today, beneath this gloomy sky, a new story was beginning. Victor Donovan entered the courtyard, his demeanor cold and full of confidence, like an artist on stage, ready for his performance. The faint light highlighted his black suit, a detail carefully calculated to make a strong impression on the crowd. He was a journalist known for his provocative stunts and controversial investigative reports, always attacking traditional values and symbols that had existed for centuries. And today, he had found his ideal target, the British Royal Guard, whom all tourists revered, but in his eyes was nothing more than a cheap decoration of a bygone empire. Liam Matthews, the guard, stood straight as a living statue, dressed in the royal military uniform, his face devoid of emotion, his deep eyes staring into the distance. No one had ever seen him display a weak gesture or a sign of fatigue, whether in the freezing winter nights or under the scorching summer sun. He was a true soldier, not a symbol of a faded legacy, but a protector of enduring values, no matter how the world around him might change. From a distance, Donovan observed Matthews. He sneered. Another historical treasure, he thought to himself. That was exactly how he viewed these guards. They just stood there, like puppets with no real value, only serving as a backdrop for tourist photos. Somehow this irritated him. He knew that with a mocking glance, he could make everyone around him reconsider what they revered. And today, he was going to do just that. Donovan walked forward, his steps firm, his gaze unmistakably confident, and his voice rang out into the silence. The whole world stands here, looking at a guard they think is a symbol of strength, when in fact, he is just a decoration. Do you realize that? Donovan did not stop his stride, walking with a confidence, as if he had complete control over the situation. His cold gaze remained fixed on Matthews, the sentry who stood unmoving like a pillar, undisturbed by the winds of change. Donovan looked at the soldier as one might look at an outdated symbol, something that had lost its power, no longer practical in this modern world. Every step Donovan took had a clear purpose, and he kept telling himself that today he would expose the falsehood. It was a battle between values that seemed to have died and a person who continued to live in the illusion. "What are you doing standing here?" Donovan spoke, his tone laced with sarcasm, not just a question, but a declaration about obsolescence. "Have you ever wondered why you have to stand here every day, keeping this stiff pose? Don't you see? It's all a farce of a fallen empire, a tradition that no longer has a place in the real world." His words echoed through the silence, but the air felt heavy, as if something was about to happen. The crowd of tourists around them began to stop, no longer paying attention to the surroundings, but focusing on the tense exchange. A few people looked up at Matthews, their eyes filled with curiosity, mixed with concern. They had never witnessed such a confrontation before, never seen anyone daring to mock such a noble symbol in this very place. Matthews did not react immediately, but inside a storm was rising. He was used to confrontations, to challenges, but never had anyone made him feel so insulted. Donovan wasn't just mocking his job. He was denying everything Matthews had spent his life protecting. He remembered the harsh training days, the battles where even a single mistake could threaten the lives of his comrades. And now, here he was a stranger, someone who had never experienced a hard day in his life. Standing here, judging his sacrifice as if it were just a game. He knew nothing. He didn't know what Matthews had faced, the sleepless nights, the moments when life hung by a thin thread. Donovan didn't know that every medal on Matthews' chest wasn't just decoration, but marks of pain, untold stories, the comrades he had lost in battle. Matthews' hands, usually calm and steady, now gripped his rifle tightly, not out of anger, but to maintain control. He didn't want to let himself be dragged into a pointless verbal war, a debate that would only serve to draw more attention to the imposter journalist. But Donovan's provocations did not stop there. He pressed on, as if going mad from not being able to reach the soldier, from not being able to draw him into the conversation, into the confrontation he had imagined. "You are part of history," Donovan said, now closer, his voice tense, as if his words were a condemnation. "But history is just the past. You stand here, protecting what's gone, while the whole world moves forward. Don't you feel ashamed, standing here every day like a soulless statue, unable to do anything but wait for photos from tourists? Don't tell me you don't see that. Don't tell me you don't realize what you're doing." A light breeze blew through, rustling the leaves on the ground. Matthews felt as if the entire space around him suddenly became suffocating. He knew that Donovan didn't just want to embarrass him. He wanted to diminish everything he represented. Each of Donovan's words felt like a sharp knife, piercing deep into him, into the memories he had struggled to forget. But he couldn't. He couldn't let this provocation go unanswered. "You know nothing about me, and you certainly don't understand who I am," Matthews said, his voice not loud but carrying a clear determination. His words weren't fueled by anger, but by the patience of someone who had witnessed too much loss, someone who had learned to master his emotions. "I don't stand here for you. I don't stand here for the tourists. I stand here for what I represent: responsibility, loyalty, sacrifice. And I don't need to explain that to you." Donovan stood still, surprised by Matthews' response. It felt like hitting an impenetrable wall, and Matthews' resilience had taken away his advantage. But he didn't give up. His frustration only grew. He stepped closer, as if challenging the sentry. "So, you still believe in those things?" Donovan asked, his voice now clearly mocking. "With everything happening in the world, you still believe in a dead symbol? You think those values still matter in a world where everything is changing?" Matthews stood upright, his eyes never leaving Donovan, but inside him, a storm of emotions was rising. He felt the tension in every muscle, waves of anger and frustration swirling in his chest, yet there was no expression on his face to reveal the internal struggle. Because a part of him, a very large part, had reminded him that this was the moment to stand firm, not out of ego or pride, but for the values he had defended and continued to protect, values that could not be easily trampled upon. Donovan noticed the prolonged silence between them, which began to irritate him. He was used to facing strong reactions from his subjects, those who could not bear the truth and fought back with aggression. But Matthews stood silently, saying nothing, merely staring at him as if challenging him. Donovan took a step closer, each move seeming to intrude further into the stillness around them. He could no longer stand it. He knew that if he did not provoke a response from Matthews today, not only would he fail in his job, but it would also be a great humiliation to everything he had built in his notorious journalism career. He decided to push forward with the provocation. "Do you think the sacrifices you made mean anything in this world? The wars that have passed, the comrades who died, all to protect things that are outdated? Do your values still matter in today's world? You stand here, amidst a crowd, and still consider yourself a protector of something great. What is it? An empire that has been dead for ages, and you still stand there like puppets." What Donovan did not know was that his words did not anger Matthews. They only filled him with sorrow. Sorrow for Donovan himself, for those like him, people who had lost the understanding of the cost of freedom, the cost of loyalty, the cost of sacrifice. Matthews sighed, but not out of exhaustion. It was patience that he had learned over years in the military, patience to face storms not only from the outside, but also from those who had never known the hardships he had endured. At that moment, he looked directly into Donovan's eyes, and his words echoed, not as reproach, but as a warning. "You know nothing about me. You understand nothing about what we have sacrificed. We stand here not for you, not for the tourists. We stand here for what we represent. And if you think it is all just a joke, try standing in my place and see how long you can endure." Donovan was taken aback by Matthews' response. He stood frozen for a moment, Matthews' words like a slap to his face, shattering all the self-satisfaction he had built over the years. He had once thought he could expose everything, that with a few sharp words, he could bring down those he saw as outdated symbols. But now, facing Matthews, he realized he had greatly underestimated this soldier, greatly underestimated what he represented. "So, what are you trying to say?" Donovan asked, struggling to maintain his composure. But in his eyes, there was no longer the confidence he had once had. Something had changed within him. He began to feel awkward, a sensation he had never felt when confronting those he called prey in his investigative reports. "Do you think I will give up?" Matthews looked at him, but this time, his gaze held no challenge or determination, only patience and empathy. He felt pity for Donovan, for someone who did not understand the value of what Matthews had been through, and for what he was wasting in his life. "No, I don't think you'll give up. But if you could understand what I'm saying, perhaps you wouldn't be standing here anymore." Matthews spoke gently, but every word carried a truth that Donovan could not deny. Between them, it was no longer a battle of who was right or wrong. Now, it had become a battle between those who had lived through life and those who had never dared to face what truly mattered. In that moment, Donovan began to feel unsure. He was no longer certain of why he was doing these things, no longer certain about his life. He wondered if he was really doing the right thing, or if he was simply trying to prolong a story that was too old, too outdated. But before Donovan could respond, something unexpected happened. Matthews, with a smooth yet firm motion, released his hand from his weapon and slowly took a step forward. Not because he wanted to continue the confrontation, but because he wanted Donovan to realize that sometimes real battles do not need to be fought. They only require understanding the values behind what might seem insignificant. Matthews stood firm like a living statue, unmoving, his gaze still directed at Donovan. But in his eyes, there was not only resilience, but also a deep sorrow. A part of him, a large part, felt pity for Donovan. Pity for a man so self-satisfied that he could not see what truly mattered in life. That regret made Matthews feel as though he were standing at a crossroads, where the values he upheld and protected might be blurred by the words of someone who did not understand them. Donovan, standing opposite, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. His provocation gradually gave way to doubt. He did not understand, could not understand. He had once been the critic of old values, believing they were nothing more than memories that had no place in the modern world. But now, standing before Matthews, he was no longer as confident as before. He had touched a deep scar in his soul, a scar he did not know how to heal. The coldness in Donovan's eyes began to melt away, replaced by unease, a confusion he could not control. He felt like a child standing before a mirror, struggling to find the truth about himself. But the more he looked, the more he saw only a blurry image. He had created a persona he believed to be strong, powerful, but now, facing a steadfast soldier, he felt like a weakling, nothing more than a pen and a camera to fabricate stories. "What do you think of people like me?" Donovan suddenly asked, his voice dropping, no longer sharp as before. "Do you think I'm a liar? Someone who only knows how to exploit the things you protect for gain?" Matthews looked into his eyes, and this time, there was no mockery or anger in his gaze. Only understanding, a kind of understanding that Matthews could feel even though Donovan did not speak it. Matthews knew that Donovan was not just trying to attack him. He was attacking himself. He was trying to find a reason to continue. But inside him, there was an emptiness he could not fill with words or false stories. "No, I do not consider you a liar," Matthews replied, his voice gentle but firm. "You are just someone who has not seen all that I have seen, someone who has not understood what I have gone through. But it's all right, you don't have to understand right now. The important thing is, if you do not change, you will never see the true value of what we do." Donovan stood silent, not replying immediately. He felt the sincerity in Matthews' words, but did not know what to do with the unease rising within him. He had spent his life creating fake stories, in relentless attacks designed to create scandals, only to now find himself facing someone who truly understood the meaning of sacrifice and loyalty. He no longer felt powerful. He felt like a failure, someone who only knew how to exploit others' battles for his own gain. And then, a moment of silence enveloped the space between them. The tourists around them began to sense that something greater was happening, an encounter not just about words, but about deeper values. Phones were no longer raised to film. Instead, eyes followed, as if they were witnessing something much more important than the usual tourist images they were accustomed to. Matthews did not hurry. He knew this was not the time for argument or further provocation. Everything was clear now. Every word had been spoken. Now, all he had to do was let Donovan realize that understanding does not always come from attacks, but sometimes from silence and patience. Donovan, Matthews continued, his voice cutting through the night. You have had a chance to see part of the truth, but I do not know if you are willing to see it. Loyalty is not something that can be easily replaced with theories or false stories. It is built from long, arduous days, from difficult decisions, from losses you have never had to endure. The entire space seemed to freeze, not just because of the overcast sky and the gloomy atmosphere, but because of the emotions surging within each person. Donovan stood there, his eyes fixed on Matthews, but now his gaze no longer held the self-satisfaction it once did, nor the sharp provocation. Instead, he seemed like a lost soul, struggling to find an answer for himself. Matthews' words still echoed in his mind, each word like a warning, a wake-up call that he was unprepared for. Opposite him, Matthews stood silently, not saying another word, merely observing. He knew that sometimes, what is most necessary is not more words, but a silence full of contemplation. Not everyone can grasp profound truths immediately, but he believed Donovan would understand, at least to some extent. He had once been a young man full of arrogance, thinking that he could change the world with theories and sharp strategies. But through the years of fighting, he had learned that true change doesn't come from exposing others' wrongs, but from facing undeniable truths within oneself. And in this moment, something happened. Something silently changed within Donovan. His provocation was no longer fueled by arrogance, but by regret. A deep sense of regret rose within him as he remembered Matthew's words. If you don't change, you will never see the true value of what we do. These words were not an attack, but a warning. Donovan had once thought he was the only one who understood the world, that with the things he wrote and presented to the public, he could uncover the truth about everything. But now, he felt like a blind man trying to lead others in the dark. A heavy feeling pressed down on his chest. He felt like he was standing at a crossroads, where each choice could change the course of his life. Part of him wanted to continue with what he had been doing, continue creating stories, continue exploiting the truth for personal gain. But another part, a deeper part of him, could not ignore the sincerity in Matthew's eyes, could not deny the value that the soldier represented. A slight noise came from the crowd, and suddenly, a tourist spoke up. I can't believe it. I have always admired these guards, but now I understand more. They are not just standing watch. They are protecting a part of history. A simple statement, but enough to make the atmosphere in the Westminster Palace courtyard feel more special than ever before. Those around began to pay closer attention, now looking at Matthews with newfound respect. They no longer saw him merely as a guard, but as a living symbol of values that could not easily be erased by shallow words. Donovan looked around and realized that truth is not always defined by words, but sometimes it is simply a waking moment from within. The crowd was starting to realize this, and he, the one who had once carried the mission of uncovering the truth, now stood before a truth he could no longer deny. He was facing Matthews, a soldier who not only protected the palace, but also defended values Donovan had never truly understood. At that moment, Matthews felt the value of silence. He didn't need to continue attacking Donovan, didn't need to prove he was right. Everything was already clear. He understood that, for Donovan, today would be a turning point. He might not realize it immediately, but from this moment on, his life would never be the same. Matthews didn't need to teach him a lesson on sacrifice or loyalty. He just needed to show him that sometimes true change comes from facing the values we take for granted. You will find your way, Matthews said, his voice no longer firm but filled with empathy. I hope you will see the true value of what I and the other soldiers do. Not because we seek glory, but because we believe that some things are worth protecting. Donovan stood still, no longer offering any rebuttal. He only felt a great wave rising within him, not of anger, but of regret. It had been a long time since he had known this feeling, the feeling of someone who realizes they were wrong, and more importantly, the feeling of someone who realizes they can change. The atmosphere in the courtyard of Westminster Palace had completely changed. The tourists, who had been crowded just moments ago, had now dispersed, each reflecting on what had just happened. A few still stood silently, but their gazes were no longer curious or absent-minded. Instead, they held understanding, as if they had realized something deeper. Matthews, still standing firm, patient as a fortress, did not move. He knew that now was not the time for explanations or lessons. Everything had been said, conveyed through glances, through his own silence, and Donovan's agitation. Donovan remained there, feeling as though a great wave was swelling within him. Matthew's words struck at his soul, at things he had always avoided, emotions he had never dared to face. Each of Matthew's words carried a truth he could not deny. And now, he no longer wished to be the one to expose everything, nor to condemn the world around him, but to be a part of the world he had thought he had long forgotten. He looked into Matthew's eyes, but this time there was no mockery, no arrogance as before. All that remained was confusion, a feeling of emptiness he had never experienced before. He looked at the soldier, at the man who had fought, sacrificed, and defended values that he, as a journalist, could not fully comprehend. But even without understanding, he felt a deep respect, as though this man had opened a new door in his soul, a door leading to a world he had never thought about. A light breeze passed through, rustling the golden leaves on the ground, bringing a little coolness and soothing the tension in the air. Donovan no longer felt short of breath, no longer felt surrounded by unanswered questions. That feeling when a person suddenly becomes aware of the truth about themselves could be painful, but also incredibly liberating. "Have you ever thought about the reason we stand here?" Donovan spoke, his voice no longer forceful, but soft, as if he was asking himself the question for the first time. Matthews did not rush to answer, simply looking at Donovan with a silent gaze, as if waiting for him to find the answer. He knew that Donovan was not a bad person, not someone who merely stirred up controversy for personal gain. He was just someone who had been lost in his work for far too long, in the world he had built for himself. But now he was beginning to realize that the stories he had created, the campaigns he had conducted, did not always reflect the truth, but merely a part of the truth, a part that had been overlooked and distorted. "We stand here," Matthews began, his voice warm but firm, "not to be a backdrop for tourists, or to prove anything. We stand here to protect what has been lost. We stand here to remind that there are values that cannot easily be erased." Donovan felt the sincerity in every word Matthews spoke. He suddenly realized that what Matthews said was not an empty theory, not a sermon or an unrealistic glorification. It was the truth, a truth he had not seen before, a truth that he, as a journalist, should have seen first, but could not because of the illusions and personal goals he had set for himself. He thought he could speak about everything, but did not understand that there were things that could not simply be spoken. They had to be experienced, had to be lived through to be truly understood. Suddenly, Donovan felt as if he had been pushed into a situation he had never prepared for. A new understanding of what Matthews represented began to creep into his mind. He realized that the criticisms he had directed at Matthews, at soldiers like him, were not only wrong, but also a deficiency in the very stories he had written. The stories he had written over the years, which seemed to be truths, were not able to reflect the full reality of what Matthews had lived through. "Thank you," Donovan unexpectedly said, his voice choking but sincere. "Thank you for showing me this. I did not understand before." Donovan's words were not just a simple thank you. They were an acknowledgement, an awakening of someone who had realized that they had lived too long in the shadows of false stories. And now, they had begun to see the light, even if it was only a tiny glimpse. Matthews looked at him, said nothing more, just nodded gently. He understood that sometimes a simple thank you is all that could be offered in that moment. The entire courtyard of Westminster Palace is now quiet again. The tourists have gradually dispersed, no longer in a hurry, no longer with eager eyes, leaving only a peaceful atmosphere, a space that seems strangely unfamiliar amidst the ancient walls and the familiar images of tradition. Matthews still stands there, in his uniform, his eyes watching everything, not letting any detail escape. But in this moment, he is no longer the solitary soldier guarding a building. He is a symbol of deeper values, of loyalty and sacrifice that not everyone can understand. Donovan has left, not as a victor in their confrontation, but as someone who has begun to see a part of the truth he had never known before. He is no longer the one challenging Matthews, but a man who has come to understand that what he was searching for was not superficial stories, battles on screens, or theories in meeting rooms. What he found was a part of himself that he had missed while chasing his career, scandals, and fleeting fame. Matthews watches Donovan's figure fading into the crowd, feeling a little lighter. He doesn't need thanks, nor recognition. What he did today was not to prove who was right or wrong, but to send a message about respect, about facing the truth, not by distorting it or seeking personal glory, but by seeing it in all its facets of life. The values he defends are not just medals or uniforms, but loyalty, sacrifice, and selfless dedication. Each step Donovan takes in the crowd seems to slow down, as though he is reflecting on what just happened. A part of him, one that he hadn't initially been aware of, has been awakened. He realizes that soldiers like Matthews, like his comrades, live not for fame, but for what they believe in and protect. What they do is not to be remembered or to set an example, but to safeguard what has kept society standing through ups and downs. At this moment, Matthews feels an unusual peace. Sometimes he thinks battles do not necessarily have to be grand conflicts, but small confrontations, battles within each individual. These battles not only decide who wins or loses, but more importantly, they determine whether we can recognize the true value of what we are protecting. He turns back to look at the palace, where the ancient buildings still stand tall, despite the passing years and changes. It hasn't changed, but that doesn't mean it's meaningless. Every brick, every wall, carries its own story, a story that not everyone knows. And in the same way, the soldiers standing guard are like that. They are not dead symbols, but living people, protecting the truth, safeguarding values built over generations. Looking at the remaining crowd, Matthews suddenly realizes something important. Each of us has a part in this story. None of us lives in isolation, and the values we protect are not just ours. They belong to everyone. And because of that, whenever a person discovers the truth about what they do, about the values they live for, it is also the moment they begin to understand that life is not just a series of events and personal goals, but a journey where every step carries a part of responsibility. Yes, Matthews thinks, this is the profound lesson everyone needs to realize. We don't live just for ourselves, but for the values we believe in. These values may not be immediately celebrated, but one day they will be seen more clearly when we face the truth without fear. And that is why Matthews still stands here, continuing the work he considers an honor, not for personal glory, but because of a deep belief that these values deserve to be protected, no matter how the world outside may change. These values are not meant to be severed, but to unite us, to help each of us realize that, whether as a guard or a journalist, we all have a role in preserving human values and the truth. Matthews continues to stand guard, his eyes not only watching those passing by, but also looking into the very values that he and his fellow soldiers are protecting. Not for personal glory, but for an eternal ideal they believe will endure, no matter what.